Imagine being 17 years old. It's your birthday night, and you're driving around with your best friend on the quiet rural roads of Alabama. There's nothing to be afraid of. Just one wrong turn, a town you don't recognize, and the growing worry that you don't know how to get back home. You stop at a small gas station and ask for directions. Then your friend calls her mother. She tells her, "Mom, don't worry. We're okay. We're on our way home." Then she adds, "I love you." Those would be the last words her mother would ever hear from her. But the most terrifying part of this story wasn't that the two girls disappeared. It was that the man who killed them would live for more than 20 years near the place where they were murdered. He got married, had children, became a respected member of his community, and people saw him as a kind, religious man, while investigators spent years searching for an unknown killer. On the night of July 31st, 1999, 17-year-old Amy Carter went out to celebrate her birthday. She was with her close friend, Sarah Miller. The plan was simple: spend some time together, drive around the area, and then head home. But somewhere along the rural roads near Ozark, Alabama, one wrong turn changed everything. They ended up on a road they didn't recognize. They no longer knew exactly where they were. And as night fell, the roads became darker and quieter. Few buildings, almost no traffic, and no one they knew in the area. Eventually, they stopped at a small gas station. They tried to figure out which way they needed to go. And during those moments, Sarah called her mother. The conversation was brief. She told her mother that they were okay and that they would be home soon. Then she said, "Mom, I love you." Her mother had no idea that those words would be the last she would ever hear from her daughter. After that, there was silence. The girls never made it home. They stopped answering their phones. Hours passed, and concern slowly turned into fear. The next morning, the search began. Family members and friends hoped the girls would be found quickly. Maybe they had simply gotten lost. Maybe the car had broken down. Maybe they had stopped somewhere to ask for help. Then authorities found their car parked along the side of a road. And something about it was strange. It didn't look like a robbery. There were no obvious signs that someone had stolen anything. Their wallets were still there. Their money was still there. Even their jewelry was still there. Almost everything appeared to be exactly where it belonged. But the girls were gone. Investigators examined the vehicle and the surrounding area. Hours passed. Then came the discovery that changed the entire case. After approximately 6 hours of searching around the vehicle, investigators opened the trunk. And inside was the horrifying truth. Amy and Sarah had been murdered. What had started as the disappearance of two teenage girls had become a double homicide. And now investigators had one question: who did this? Investigators began collecting evidence. They examined the car. They searched for fingerprints. They questioned people in the area. They reviewed everything they could find. But the most important piece of evidence came from forensic testing: DNA. There was a genetic sample that could potentially lead directly to the killer. In a perfect world, this should have been the end of the mystery. Investigators would take the sample, run it through a database, a name would appear, and the investigation would finally have a suspect. But 1999 was not the world we live in today. The DNA was compared against the databases available at the time. There was no match, no name, no known suspect, no criminal record connected to the sample. The investigators had something extremely valuable, but they had no idea who it belonged to. And that was when the case became a mystery that would last for years. The killer had not managed to erase his DNA. He was simply not in the database. But the real surprise was somewhere else. The man who had left that evidence behind had not fled to another country. He had not disappeared under a fake name. He had not moved thousands of miles away. He was close, very close. Only a short distance from the crime scene, a man named Michael Collins was living an ordinary life. He worked, he got married, he built a family, he raised his children, and he became involved in his local religious and social community. To the people who knew him, Michael did not look like a killer. Quite the opposite. He was quiet, kind, and respected. As the years passed, it became harder and harder for anyone to imagine that this man could be connected to the murders of 2 teenage girls. But investigators never completely gave up. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. More than 500 interviews and interrogations took place over the years. And still, Michael Collins's name never emerged as the answer to the case. He continued living his life while the victims' families remained trapped in the past. Every year brought the same question. Would they ever find out who killed their daughters? Then everything changed. A new technology emerged that would become one of the most powerful tools in modern criminal investigations: genetic genealogy. The idea was completely different. Instead of searching only for the person whose DNA directly matched the evidence, investigators could search for distant genetic relatives, people who had never committed a crime, people who might not even know anything about the case. But their DNA could contain enough information to help investigators build a family tree, and that was exactly what happened. The old DNA sample was compared with public genetic genealogy databases. Distant genetic connections appeared, then more connections. Investigators began building a massive family tree. Every new name narrowed the possibilities: family, relatives, locations, generations. The circle became smaller and smaller until one name finally appeared. A man nobody expected. A man who had spent all those years living close to where the crime happened. A man who, in the eyes of the people around him, had never looked like a suspect. Michael Collins. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed direct evidence. A DNA sample was obtained from the suspect. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would it match? The answer was yes. The genetic match confirmed that the man who had lived an ordinary life for more than 2 decades was connected to the murders of the 2 girls. A case that had once seemed impossible was finally beginning to reach its conclusion. In 2023, more than 20 years after the murders, the case reached the courtroom. Time had changed everything. Amy and Sarah were no longer teenagers waiting to come home. Their families had spent more than 2 decades carrying the same unanswered question. But this time, there was something investigators didn't have in 1999. Forensic evidence that could finally speak for the victims. The killer was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. After more than 20 years, the wait for justice was finally over. But this case leaves us with a question that goes far beyond the murders themselves. Because the DNA wasn't only connected to the killer, it was also connected to other families. Distant relatives who had never committed a crime. People who had used genealogy websites for completely personal reasons, to discover their ancestry, to find relatives they never knew existed. But their genetic information could, indirectly, help law enforcement identify suspects in decades-old crimes. And that raises a difficult question. Is this a victory for justice? Or is it a price we should not be willing to pay for privacy? If your DNA could help police catch a killer who had escaped justice for 20 or 30 years, would you consider that a good thing? But what if that information could be used without you even knowing? Where should society's right to pursue justice end? And where does a person's right to genetic privacy begin? Tell me what you think in the comments. Would you support the use of public genetic genealogy databases to solve cold cases? On a cold evening in October 1987, Daniel Morgan returned home to Santa Rosa, California. It was close to 9 o'clock at night. He parked his car outside the house, walked up the stairs, and opened the front door. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but after taking a few steps inside, Daniel realized that something was terribly wrong. One of the chairs had been knocked over. A small table in the living room had been pushed out of place. There were obvious signs of a violent struggle on the floor. Then he saw his wife. Elizabeth Morgan, 30 years old, was lying motionless on the living room floor. There was no response. Daniel immediately called the police. Within minutes, police officers and investigators filled the house. Elizabeth worked as a manager at a local healthcare facility. Her life appeared stable, and she lived with her husband in a quiet neighborhood. That was why her murder was so difficult to understand. But investigators noticed something that led them toward an immediate theory. Elizabeth's car was missing. So was her purse. To the investigators, the explanation seemed obvious. Perhaps burglars had broken into the house. Maybe Elizabeth had discovered them. A struggle followed, and she was killed. The burglars then took her car and purse and escaped. On paper, the theory made sense, but several details didn't fit. The house had not been thoroughly ransacked. Valuable items were still there. There was no widespread search for money or jewelry, as you might expect during a typical burglary. Instead, most of the disturbance was concentrated around the area where the struggle appeared to have taken place. And then there was another strange piece of evidence. A deep bite mark on Elizabeth's arm. It appeared to have been left by someone who had been extremely close to her during the confrontation. For her father, Robert Hill, this detail mattered. But he had another reason for refusing to accept the burglary theory. Before Elizabeth was murdered, she had told her family about a woman named Karen Holmes. Karen was a police officer in the city. She had also been romantically involved with Daniel in the past. Their relationship had ended before Daniel married Elizabeth, but according to Elizabeth's family, Karen had never fully accepted the end of that relationship. She began appearing in places where Elizabeth was. Then strange phone calls started. Sometimes, Elizabeth felt as if someone was watching her. At first, she tried to ignore it. She didn't want to live in fear because of an old relationship that was supposedly over. But the situation became increasingly tense. There were confrontations between the two women. Elizabeth had told members of her family that she no longer felt comfortable being alone. And most importantly, her family knew that Karen was angry about Daniel's marriage. After Elizabeth was killed, her father told police everything he knew. He wanted them to investigate Karen. But the investigators didn't believe they had enough reason to do so. There was no physical evidence connecting her to the crime. No witness had seen Karen inside the house. And because Karen was a police officer, accusing her without direct evidence would have been extremely difficult. So her name never became the center of the investigation. Elizabeth's family saw things differently. To them, it wasn't simply a theory. There had been threats. There had been a previous relationship. And there appeared to be a possible motive. But police chose another explanation. A burglary, unknown suspects, and an unsolved murder. Weeks passed, then months. No burglar was identified, no witness came forward, and no evidence connected anyone to the crime. Eventually, the case was placed into the cold case files. Elizabeth's murder became one of the many cases that had never been solved, but one piece of evidence had not disappeared. The sample taken from the bite mark. Back in 1987, DNA technology was nowhere near as powerful as it would become decades later. So the sample was preserved as evidence. Years passed. The case disappeared into the archives. Investigators changed. Departments changed. The city changed. But the file remained. And somewhere inside that file was a tiny piece of evidence that would eventually change everything. Then came 2002. A forensic investigator named Margaret Collins began reviewing a number of old unsolved murder cases. Her goal was simple: Find evidence that had been useless in the past but might become valuable with modern technology. She came across Elizabeth's case. She began reading everything. Then she reached the original crime scene report. She stopped at the bite mark. She asked one question. Was the sample still available? At first, she was told it was gone, but Margaret refused to accept that answer. She searched the old records, then the evidence storage facility, then the medical examiner's archives, and after days of searching, she found something no one expected. The sample was still there. More than 15 years had passed, but it had survived. It was sent to a laboratory for modern DNA testing. Then the results came back. The DNA belonged to a woman. That moment changed the case. The original theory involved armed burglars, but the DNA found on Elizabeth's body did not belong to a man. It belonged to a woman. Margaret began looking at the people who could have had a motive, and Karen Holmes returned to the center of her attention. Margaret reviewed everything connected to her relationship with Daniel, her confrontations with Elizabeth, and the information Elizabeth's family had provided during the original investigation. None of those details alone was enough. But when they were placed together, they began to form a disturbing picture. Margaret tried to push the investigation forward, but this time she encountered another problem. Karen wasn't just a potential suspect. She was a police officer, and she understood the system from the inside. As questions began to surface, Margaret faced resistance within the department. Her conclusions were questioned. She was told not to build a case around suspicion alone. Eventually, she was removed from the investigation. Once again, the case went quiet. But something had changed. Police now knew that female DNA had been found on Elizabeth's body. Investigators also knew that Karen had a connection to both Elizabeth and her husband. There was a lead, but there was no match. 7 more years passed. Then came 2010. Detective Thomas Reed took another look at the case. He was the kind of investigator who hated leaving unanswered questions behind. He read the file from the beginning. Then he went back to the evidence that had been overlooked. When he reached the bite mark sample, he realized the case might be much closer to being solved than anyone had thought. They had DNA. They had a potential female suspect, but they needed a direct comparison. The problem? Karen wasn't going to simply volunteer a DNA sample if she knew why investigators wanted it. So the team decided not to confront her directly. They began watching her. They were looking for an opportunity to obtain something she would naturally leave behind. A cup, a bottle, a personal item. Anything that might contain human cells. Then the opportunity came. One day, Karen was drinking from a plastic cup. When she finished, she threw it into a trash bin. To Karen, the cup meant nothing, but to investigators it could change the history of the case. The cup was recovered, and it was sent to the laboratory. Then the comparison began. DNA from the cup. DNA from the sample taken from Elizabeth's arm in 1987. The team waited. Then the result arrived. A complete match. It was no longer just a theory. The DNA left by a woman on Elizabeth's body matched Karen Holmes, a woman who knew the victim, a woman who had been connected to her husband, a woman whose name had been somewhere in the background of the case for years. And now there was scientific evidence linking her directly to the victim. But investigators knew a DNA match alone wasn't enough. They had to build the entire case. They returned to the crime scene. They studied the old photographs. They examined the position of the furniture. They reviewed the signs of the struggle. And once again, they looked at the missing car and purse. If robbery had been the motive, why were valuable items still inside the house? Why was the violence concentrated around Elizabeth? And why was there a bite mark suggesting such a close, personal confrontation? Piece by piece, the original theory began to collapse. The house no longer looked like the scene of a random burglary. It looked like a confrontation between two people. Someone had entered the house, and someone had a personal reason for confronting Elizabeth. Investigators went back even further. There were reports of tension between Karen and Elizabeth, and evidence suggesting that jealousy and an obsession with her former relationship with Daniel may have played a role in the motive. But there was still one problem: Karen herself. How would they confront an experienced police officer? The team decided to use a ruse. Karen was contacted and told that police needed her help, questioning a suspect in another case. She didn't suspect anything. She went to the police station. She entered the building believing she was there to help her colleagues. Then the door opened. The investigators were waiting, along with the file, photographs of Elizabeth, and the evidence that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. Then they told her about the DNA sample. It was no longer simply the word of the victim's family. It wasn't based on old memories. There was scientific evidence that had remained silent for more than 20 years. The case eventually went to trial. The court heard about the history of the relationship, the family's testimony, the details from the crime scene, and the mistakes made during the original investigation. But the strongest piece of evidence was the one that never spoke: the DNA. A tiny sample that had survived for years. A piece of evidence that could easily have been lost or ignored, but it remained. And eventually it reopened the case. In the end, Karen Holmes was convicted of Elizabeth Morgan's murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. For Elizabeth's family, the verdict could never bring their daughter back. It couldn't return the more than 20 years they had spent waiting for answers. But finally, they received something they had been searching for since that first night: the truth. And perhaps the most disturbing part of the story isn't simply that the killer remained unidentified for so many years. It's that one of the most important pieces of evidence had been there all along. It was waiting for someone to look at it again. Elizabeth's family had said from the beginning that the crime didn't look like an ordinary burglary, but the investigation followed the easiest explanation: unknown burglars. Then the years passed, and eventually, the case became just another cold file. But the truth had never disappeared. It was sitting somewhere inside an evidence box, inside a tiny biological sample, inside details that nobody had paid enough attention to. And more than 20 years later, that tiny piece of evidence helped bring the truth back to the surface. So perhaps the hardest question is this: how many other murder cases were closed because investigators became attached to the first explanation that seemed to make sense? And how many important clues were ignored simply because they weren't understood at the time? Elizabeth's case is a reminder that a good investigation isn't only about finding evidence. It's also about knowing when to return to old evidence and look at it with fresh eyes. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't disappear. It's simply waiting for someone to look for it again.